Hi BookTube, it's Amy. I'm here with another segment of my 2024 bookshelf tour. Let's start with the big one here. This is my 11 volume set of the Diary of Samuel Pepys, and volume 3 is off the shelf just now because I'm reading that. I'm about midway through that volume. I read volume 1 and 2 last year, and 2023 is when I sought out each of these volumes and made a home for them on my shelf. At least I think it was 2023. If it was 2022, then I've lost track of my time, to be honest. 22 and 23, those 2 years kind of blend together for me. I hardly remember what's what, just because of the events in my personal life last year. But this is the full diary, not abridged, published in English in the 1970s. Prior to the 1970s, you could only really get abridged copies. There hadn't been a complete set published like this. And if you don't know Pepys, he was well, perhaps he wouldn't really be someone of note if he hadn't, someone of note that we'd remember if he hadn't kept this diary. But he was, as far as I can tell, at least as far as I've gotten, he is essentially a public servant living in the United Kingdom in the 1600s. He begins his diary in 1660 while he's in his 20s, his early to mid 20s, and he carries it on all the way to the end of 69, and then there is a companion volume with a lot of different information about things you might read. There's a section on food, there's a section on the celebration of Christmas and Twelfth Night, there's a section on, the canals and rivers of London, and pretty much any supplementary material that you might want to try to understand the book is in this 10th volume. And then volume 11 is an index. But it's an absolutely fascinating diary. He talks about his wife, about his home. There's one kind of hilarious scene where he seems to be getting the stairs redone in his house, and he and his wife are still trying to live in this house while the stairs are being done. And he talks about how troublesome it is to have to climb up to the second floor of the house without stairs, and eventually he sends his wife off to stay with, I can't remember whether it's her mother or his parents, but he sends his wife off, and you think, oh good, they're going to go stay somewhere else. But no, he goes back to the house without the stairs to the second floor, and proceeds to stay there with his wife, staying away until the house is complete. And some of it is pretty mundane stuff. He went into the office, and they paid out the salary due to, I think it's the Navy. He ends up being a fairly high-ranking, I think, public servant later on in his career, but I haven't gotten that far yet. But it's a little bit mundane, but I guess it's one of those works that tells us a lot more than we would ever have known about the 17th century in England otherwise. And definitely very interesting. If it's something that you think you would want to read, this diary. The interesting thing is Pepys wrote it in shorthand, a little known shorthand that was only really popular for a couple of decades. And so after his death, nobody else could read it, and it took a couple hundred years for them to figure out the shorthand. You had people trying to decode it, all these cryptographers coming in, and all along the volume with the shorthand that Pepys had been using was sitting in the very same library collection as the original volumes of his diary, but nobody had looked at it and made that connection. And I'm enjoying it. It was such a pleasure to collect all the volumes. Despite what you see here, Some are Bell editions, which are the UK publications, and at least one of them it says California on the spine, which is the American printing. And they all kind of look the same on the shelf, but some of them have a green edge and some of them have a white edge. But they all work nicely to make a set. And next to Peeps is my 5-volume collection of the works of the poet Thomas Gray. I picked these up at the Antiquarian Book Fair in Toronto this past fall. And they're a beautiful little set of books. It was this volume of correspondence that really caught my eye and is sort of why I purchased it. The volume of correspondence is from 1843, and the other volumes are, this one's a little bit damaged, but the others are in great condition. The other ones are from just a few years earlier in 1836. I do believe that the first 4 volumes would have been published, and then the correspondence followed a couple years after. But I'll see if I can show you here. It's probably not going to show it very well, but bound by, and I'll see if I can pronounce this, I also kind of struggle, Zazdor, which is a well-known binder of the 19th century. And so I'm slowly working my way through those. And next to that is my other purchase from the Antiquarian Book Fair this fall in Toronto. And it's a Hugh Thompson illustrated edition of The History of Henry Esmond. And Hugh Thompson was a early 20th century, late 19th century illustrator, known for his beautiful, beautiful illustrations. I haven't actually read this novel by Thackeray. It's on my list pretty high up to read this year, but I've started sort of collecting some of the illustrated editions by Hugh Thompson, because he did a couple of J.M. Barrie's plays, one of my other collecting interests, and they were so beautiful that I sought out some of his other illustrated works. And when we get to these shelves here, we'll talk a bit more about some of those Thompson bindings. So let's move down. The other day we did do this shelf, so we'll go farther down to where there are some more classics, a few miscellaneous items here. And just sliding down here to the floor. So we have here a little book, which is a guide to the English Lake District. And I found it very, very cheap. I think I either paid less than $1 for it, or it might have been in a little free library. I know it felt essentially free, but it is, just as it says, it is a tourism guide, and I think we've got a publication date in here somewhere, but it is from the mid-20th century, and I don't think we do have a publication date, but as you can see, some lovely color maps that fold out. But I have it as more of a companion to the poetry of the lake poets, and that's why it's sort of here by Adam Sisman's joint biography of Wordsworth and Coleridge titled The Friendship. And if you at all like the poetry of Wordsworth and Coleridge, you're at all interested in the lake poets, this is an excellent, excellent biography. I think I read it in the summer of 2020. And this is just sort of randomly thrown in here, Canadian Houses of Romance by Catherine Hale with drawings by Dorothy Stevens. And it is just about sort of famous tourist locations, historical houses in Canada. and it's from 1926. And there is a little bit in the contents there. It's mainly in, I think, Quebec and Ontario, these houses, in around Montreal and Ottawa and Kingston. But I remember spending a delightful summer's day reading that when I first bought it. Then we have Eden's Outcasts, the story of Louisa May Alcott and her father by John Matheson. This is another great joint biography, and that's sort of why it's shelved next to the Wordsworth and Coleridge one, because it's also a joint biography about literary figures. Louisa May Alcott, of course, the author of Little Women, Good Wives, Little Men, and a whole slew of other novels. And her father, I think his name was Bronson Alcott, that makes sense. I was blanking on his name for a moment, but he was very involved in intellectual and literary circles in his own day and in his own right, and actually took his family to live on a very famous farming commune, which they lasted a few years, but that certainly had a mark on Louisa's childhood. And next to that is a little Everyman Library edition of William Blake's poetry. This is one of the very early J.M. Dent Everyman Library editions. Of course, the poetry of William Blake is well known, iconic. I have fond memories of reading it in high school English. I wouldn't say, it speaks to me more than any other poet, but I do enjoy it. Next to that is my copy of Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. And this particular copy was purchased for me, I believe, for Christmas one year. It was either a Christmas or a birthday by my grandma. And it is just a very beautiful edition here. It's just a Barnes & Noble classic. Usually if there's a Barnes & Noble classic on my shelf, it was a gift from the American side of my family. So next to that is Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. This is just a Penguin Classics edition that I picked up a couple of years ago because I had gotten rid of the... I won't say the original because it's not the original copy I had read Pride and Prejudice with. I had gotten rid of the original copy that I purchased several years ago just because it was kind of a tight, I think it was like a Signet paperback or something really cheap. And so I had gotten rid of that and then a few years later decided to repurchase. But I originally read Pride and Prejudice from my local library as a teenager. I remember there was a couple of weeks, I think I was about 15 or 16 years old, where I read Jane Austen. I read all of the available Jane Austen, not including, her unpublished early works, but I started out with... I think I read Northanger Abbey. I read Pride and Prejudice. Should say I read Pride and Prejudice for the second time, sort of. I had gotten halfway through Pride and Prejudice a couple years earlier, but I don't think I finished it at that time because I think I was a little bit young to fully grasp just how delightful the plot was. But I read Pride and Prejudice, followed by Sense and Sensibility. And somewhere in there, I also read Mansfield Park, Persuasion, and Emma. And I couldn't really tell you in which order I read them. But to this day, Persuasion remains my favorite novel by Jane Austen. I just love that story, sort of about it is a story about a second chance at love. Two people who parted and who meet again, and have a second chance at happiness. And Mansfield Park, it's, it is what it is. It's not really my favorite at all. In fact, out of all the Jane Austens, I think Mansfield Park might be my least favorite. Next to that is Villette by Charlotte Bronte, the first Charlotte Bronte that I read even before Jane Eyre, and I remember loving it, and I think I've reread it since then. There is a little bit, or at least you think there's a little bit of a ghost story involved, but there is a romance and this wonderful, almost gothic school atmosphere, and it's just a very enjoyable read. Next to that is, and you can't see the title on the spine here, so I'm going to open it up for us, Erasmus and Cambridge, the Cambridge Letters of Erasmus, translated by D.F.S. Thomas, with an introduction, commentary, and notes by H.C. Porter from the University of Toronto Press. And you'll see my little bookmark still stuck halfway through. Next to that is some selected prefaces and introductions from W. Somerset Maugham. All my W. Somerset Maugham novels are on the opposite wall, so we'll see when we get to those, probably at least 6 videos from now. We'll eventually get to the W. Somerset Maugham, but this is just a collection of prefaces and introductions that he would have written for perhaps some of his own works, but also for the works of other people, because he was often called upon or asked to write prefaces to the works of other authors. Next to this is a novel set in Quebec titled The Town Below by Roger Lemlin. This is a New Canadian Library edition. I purchased and read this as part of a independent reading project and essay in my high school English class. So it's been a good 12 years since I read it, just going on about 12 years since I read it. So maybe it's time for a reread. But I do recall it being kind of a coming-of-age story. And I guess it must have paired well with Hugh MacLean's Two Solitudes. But right now I'm blanking on almost the entire plot. But next to that are 3 Harlequin romances. Now, as a teenager from about the age of 14 to 17, I had an obsession with the vintage Harlequin romances. Now, I really wasn't allowed to read anything new. Anything published kind of after 1980 was off limits, but anything from the 70s or the 60s were within bounds, and I was allowed to purchase and buy those. And I could pick them up for relatively cheap, for between $1 and $4 or $5. And I had gotten rid of my entire collection. I had maybe 100 of these, and there were summers where I would read 2 or 3 of these Harlequin romances, and maybe, a Louis L'Amour or 2 thrown in there as well. Westerns and romances, that was my light summer reading. But back in 2020, when I didn't have a whole lot to do, I got to thinking about some of my favorite titles, and I repurchased some of them. I realized that I had favorite authors and I didn't even know it because I was just looking by the titles I remembered. And then I realized, it's Nerina Hillard and Sarah Seeley, my 2 favorite authors. And I did have a couple more books that I picked up by Sarah Seeley, but then I got rid of them again because I thought, okay, I've reread them, don't need to reread them again. But it's these 3 that I ultimately end up going back to every now and then when I'm in the mood for a light romance. So Dear Professor by Sarah Seeley. And I think it's a mini dress she's wearing. That's pretty fun. But this is one from, and I think it's the 70s. Yeah. So from 1971, this is the third printing. It was obviously a very popular one. But we have our main character, and I think it's her cousin or her sister. Her cousin, yes. Sylvie's cousin, Sarah, is, flirty. She's attractive. She's a man magnet wherever she goes. And Sylvie is not that way at all. Sylvie looks after animals. Sylvie is quieter. Sylvie is introspective and thoughtful. But her cousin meets a very attractive man while she's on holiday, and they exchange correspondence addresses. And when this man writes to her cousin doesn't really feel like answering. And she writes a little bit, but as time goes by, she doesn't really care at all. She's got plenty of other men around. And so it is our main character, Sylvie, who decides to take it upon herself to answer these letters that her cousin has shared with her. And she gets up this correspondence, and all is well until the man she's been writing to decides to come and visit her cousin. And of course, her cousin decides that, now, like, this is her beau and she's not going to let her take him. And so Sylvie has to stay quiet. And, I realized I got the names. The names mixed up. Sarah is our main character. Sylvie is the cousin. But Sarah decides that she's going to do as her cousin Sylvie asks and not interfere, because how can she possibly explain that she's been pretending to be her cousin? And so she has to watch her cousin Sylvie have this romantic relationship with the man that she's fallen in love with. And so that's a fun one. And then we have The Scars Shall Fade by Nerina Hilliard. Another one from, I think this one is from the 70s as well. But our heroine here is actually 1960. So this one's earlier. This is from 1960. But our heroine, Trina, is a dancer. And she's been having an affair with a married man. That affair goes badly. She is injured, and she decides that she must find other work as she can no longer dance. And so off she goes to this country estate where she is hired on as the governess for these two young children. And the father of the family has this unsightly scar on his face, and as you can guess, they fall in love. But of course, there's a misunderstanding thrown in there. And then Dark Star, also by Nerina Hilliard. Nerina Hilliard seems to like these misunderstandings and the conniving, scorned woman who wants to derail things for our heroine. But this is one about, and let me just double check the name, Lee. Lee has a very beautiful sister who is a movie star, and Lee has been in love and is happily recently engaged. But then she discovers that her fiancé and her sister are having an affair, and her fiancé has fallen in love with her sister. And what she doesn't know is that her sister isn't in love with her fiancé at all. She's just doing out of spite, out of jealousy. But our heroine, Lee, being who she is, wants to ensure her sister's happiness because she believes her sister is really in love with her fiancé. And so she decides the only way to take herself out of the equation and allow them to be happy and not, hide their love out of loyalty to her, the only way for her to fix this situation is to announce that she has been falling in love with her boss and she is now engaged to him. And the only reason her boss wants to marry her is because he's just found out that he won't inherit this, grand island estate unless he is married. That was the stipulation of the will. And so they get married and off they go and they're falling in love. But then her sister shows up to make more problems, and her ex-fiance shows up to make more problems, and we have the misunderstandings. Think of them what you will, but I do enjoy those kind of absolutely ridiculous, exotic location romances where everything always turns out all right in the end. And next to those Harlequins is Colette's Gigi and the Cat, two shorter works by Colette. Gigi was made into a great film, and the cat, well, I think the cat is almost better than Gigi. The husband is upset over his wife's cat and takes some vindictive action towards the cat. Next to that, we have a fun one titled Sex and the Single Girl by Helen Gurley Brown, which was published in the 1960s, I believe. Let me just double check this. It's considered a cult classic, 1962. And it's exactly what you would imagine the title to be. It's about how to be single, how to date, and sort of how to carry on with men, how to have your sex life in the 60s. I'm sure it was quite scandalous, but some of the advice, not so applicable today. She's talking about, how to take not take advantage, how to use to your advantage your position as a woman. This chapter, the availables, the men in your life. Saying, don't marry them, don't have an affair with them, but in instances where a man is necessary, make sure you have some men on hand. How to be sexy. A lot of it's just absolutely hilarious, but I will say I do enjoy the chapter on the apartment, how to furnish an apartment. Maybe don't care so much about where it's located, but focus on how you decorate it, how to dress yourself, get some fine jewelry rather than, a bunch of pieces of costume jewelry. And even if you're not earning much, do what you can with what you have. And so it's partly, I've read it several times, partly because there is a little bit of good advice in there. Certainly not how to use men. I do not use men. But, there's some good advice about, career and furnishing your apartment and how to entertain. And then there's just some absolutely hilarious, outdated, downright wrong stuff that would have been, I guess, applicable to the era in which it was written. But it is kind of a fun read. If you're looking for something to give you a laugh, this is a good one to read. And in line with that, I thought, okay, here is our vintage book on how to behave. And here is kind of the opposite, which is more modern, something called How to Be a Lady, A Contemporary Guide to Common Courtesy by Candace Simpson Giles, who I believe is an American. I think she may have something to do with American politics, but I could be completely off base on that. It was just the book itself and the fact that it's full of a bunch of quotes about how to behave. Some applicable, some funny, some I downright disagree with. But it felt like it should be shelved next to Sex and the Single Girl. A lady does not taste another person's food. Well, I would disagree because I think I'm quite the lady and my friend and I taste each other's food all the time. When dining in a restaurant, a lady feels free to ask for a doggy bag or a to-go box. Definitely. A lady chews her food quietly. Definitely. how to start a conversation, how to write a sympathy note, a lady gives a party. All sorts of fun stuff like that. And over the years, I've dipped into sort of vintage etiquette books and whatnot for the fun of it. Then next to that, I have, I guess I would call YouTuber books. So this is one that I quite enjoyed. I think it was a 2022 or 2023 release. A 2023 release. This is by an Australian poet and Instagrammer. He does have a presence here on YouTube as well, but I discovered him on Instagram, and that's where I think he does most of his posting. But this is a book of street poetry that he published in 2023. His name is Jaden Lucatard, and I quite enjoyed it. I'd read a lot of his poetry on Instagram, and so I certainly purchased the book when it came out, and it's partially, I guess, autobiographical, and there's all sorts of fun images in it, and I think what I found most interesting about it is that he spent a lot of time, I guess, out and about on the streets talking with other people and observing things in the sort of the height of the COVID pandemic. And it's one of the first works I've read that directly deals with the pandemic and what it was like to live in a city during that time. And because I'd bought that, I ended up, there's actually 2 copies of it here. One because I'd made some notes in it, and then another that's a clean copy because I thought, ooh, I kind of made a mess of that. But this is another work. Jaden Attard is also an author on it, and there's a couple of other authors there with him, Jay and R.C. Walden, who I think both have YouTube presences. But the best parts of the book are those written by Jaden Attard. And once again, it's sort of this mix between prose and poetry, sort of autobiographical, once again looking at the city of Melbourne, Australia, over a certain period of time, and the people that they met there. So interesting, but I think the street poet is my favorite of the 2. And next to that, I have a copy of a book by one of our favorite people here on BookTube. I'm sure most of my viewers know him, Sean D. Standfast. This is his poetry collection titled Dark Passages, Moments of Transition. And Sean tells me that the publisher is no longer printing it, so I don't know if that makes my copy rare. Either way, I put a few sticky notes in it on some of my favorites. And next to that is my own little booklet, a copy of my own little booklet I put together for family members for Christmas, looking at some of the coins in my grandfather's coin collection, and making some observations and notes about them. I am by no means an expert on coins, but I did take a stab at that. And then next to that, I have a copy of Stephen King's On Writing. It ended up there because, well, that's where there was space. This was a gift for Christmas this year from an old high school friend that I met up with when I was visiting family over Christmas, and he's been reading a lot of Stephen King, and he rather naively said to me, I hope you haven't read this one yet. But I was like, oh yes, I've read that one. That's probably one of my favorite books by Stephen King. You know, I don't have a Stephen King collection anymore because I purged those novels to make space for other books, knowing that should I ever want to read Stephen King again, or when I want to read Stephen King again, he is so widely accessible that I can pick up his books pretty much anywhere. But I did used to have a paperback copy of On Writing, which is Stephen King's memoir. but I don't think I have it anymore. If I do, it is somewhere. It is somewhere. But I was very pleased to receive this hardcover copy for Christmas from my friend, who I hadn't seen in like a decade. And it's crazy to think that that much time had gone by since I'd seen him last. And a little bit crazy to think that even more time had gone by since I'd seen most of the people I went to high school with. But we'll end it there. Goodness, we're at 35 minutes. We still have one layer on this shelf here, which is once again just some miscellaneous books. And then we'll move over to some more of the books on books.